Welcome! In this video, we'll be discussing trauma-informed interviewing. First, we will be discussing trauma generally. Then, we will discuss the adverse effects of trauma and how these might affect our clients. And finally, we will discuss how we can be trauma-informed lawyers during our client interviews. We are going to start by talking about what trauma is. To be trauma-informed, it's important to have a general understanding of trauma. We're going to look at the official definition from the Federal Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration to frame our discussion of trauma-informed interviewing. Individual trauma results from an event, a series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So let's break this down. For something to result in trauma, there are two criteria. First, the person experiences physical or emotional harm or feeling like their life is threatened. It's the experience of the individual that is important. And secondly, that experience results in lasting adverse effects. And let's look at the source. Often, when one thinks of trauma, they think of one singular event, like an accident or a violent attack, and that can certainly be the case. However, trauma can result from not only an event, but a series of events, or a set of circumstances. In fact, there are 4 categories of trauma. The 4 categories of trauma are acute, chronic, complex, and historical and racial. The first category of trauma is acute trauma, the singular event that most people think of that leads to a feeling of being harmed or threatened and results in lasting adverse effects. The second type of trauma is chronic trauma. Chronic trauma results from repeated and prolonged exposure to highly stressful events, which in and of themselves might not meet the definition of trauma, but do when experienced for prolonged periods of time. Examples of this include living in poverty, living in a community experiencing frequent violence, being the victim of chronic bullying, or having a long-term illness. The third category of trauma is complex trauma. Complex trauma results from repeated and prolonged exposure to events that do meet the definition of trauma, often from an early age. Examples include childhood abuse and neglect, or witnessing domestic violence. Complex trauma often has significant adverse effects throughout one's life. And finally, the last category of trauma is historical and racial trauma. Researchers have found that systemic oppression and racism can result in trauma, meeting that two-pronged definition. This includes systemic racism, discrimination, and harassment. Think about the many different ways that individuals, including us, including our clients, can experience trauma throughout our lives. Even if we never experience that one acute trauma, that singular event that most people think of, we can still be experiencing adverse effects from one of the other categories of trauma. So, what are the adverse effects of trauma? How might trauma impact our clients during a client interview? While trauma does not impact everyone in the same way, we are going to look at some common emotional, physical, and cognitive effects. Emotionally, a client who has had trauma exposure could become angry for what appears to be no reason, experience anxiety that appears to be irrational, or present as emotionally detached. For example, in a custody case, a client might appear as if they don't really care about the outcome when you know very much that they would like to maintain custody of the child. You can imagine how any of these might make navigating a client interview difficult. Physically, trauma exposure can lead to sleep disturbances. Clients may miss meetings because they weren't able to wake up in time, or be unable to focus in a meeting because they are sleep deprived. Additionally, trauma exposure can lead to hyperarousal, when a person's body kicks into that fight, flight, or freeze mode when there's no clear danger. And cognitively, trauma exposure can result in difficulty making decisions, inconsistent or unclear memory, and magical thinking that a problem might go away just on its own if we ignore it. Again, you can imagine how any of these might impact a client interview.
So, how do we conduct trauma-informed client interviews?
We can practice trauma-informed lawyering. Trauma-informed lawyering approaches clients with the mindset of not, what is wrong with my client? Why can't they just answer my question? To what happened to my client? We know that this approach can help prevent further re-traumatization and results in better advocacy for our clients. So how do we do that in an interview? We're going to be looking at what we can do before, at the start, during, and after the interview to be trauma-informed. And I'm sure you'll notice that a lot of these strategies are great to use for all interviews, even if the client hasn't been exposed to trauma, or we're not sure if they have or they haven't. Before the interview, we can plan and prepare. The importance of this cannot be overstated. We want to think about the space that we're having the interview in, whether that be physical or virtual. We want to make sure that we have all of our questions ready and that we have strategies we can use if the client shuts down. Also, check in with yourself. Can you be a calming presence during the interview? Take some time to do some deep breathing or practice mindfulness. At the start of the interview, if it's in person, ask the client where they would like to sit and have multiple options prepared ahead of time. That's part of the planning. Virtually, that's a little bit trickier. But you definitely want to take time in the beginning to break the ice and build that rapport, develop that trusting and safe relationship. Offer to take frequent breaks. If you've already gone over confidentiality with the client, remind them again. Let clients know that it's okay to say, I don't know. Be transparent about the structure of the interview. Go over an agenda at the beginning. Let them know what you will be asking so there's no surprises. And finally, before taking written notes, explain to the client why you will be taking them and ask them if it's okay. You could even offer to let the client see the notes at the end of the interview. During the interview, the most important thing you can do is practice empathic listening, that active listening, to build that trust and safe relationship with the client. You can do that by acknowledging discomfort. Hey, it seems as if that was a tough question for you. Being intentional about validating feelings, both verbally and with body language. And encouraging narrative responses with pauses, without interrupting. Let the pauses be. If asking difficult questions, let your client know why you are asking them. Let them know how the answers to these questions are going to help them with their case and help them achieve their goal. After a client has shared something difficult with you, thank them. Really just by saying, thank you for sharing that with me. That can be really helpful. And again, remind them that they can take breaks as needed. Research has consistently shown that a technique called grounding can be very effective if a client is experiencing adverse effects during the interview. Let's look at what grounding is. If you notice that your client appears distressed, grounding can help bring them back to the present, to remind their body that they are in a safe space. So how do you do that? Encourage the client to focus on a physical object or a physical movement to connect them to the present. There are countless grounding techniques, but a few that work well in client interviews include: first, asking a client if they would like to stop for a second and get something to drink can be helpful. The physical act of drinking can often ground a client. You can also prompt a client by modeling an action. You could say, hey, we've really been talking for a while. I'm going to get a quick glass of water. Often that will prompt the client to do the same. Making observations about physical space is a common grounding technique. For example, saying something like, there are a lot of paintings in this office. Do you have a favorite one? Of course, this is much harder on Zoom. If appropriate, you can compliment something about the client's space, maybe a child's drawing or a shirt they are wearing, but be mindful. If it's not prominent in the background, it might be better to avoid commenting. You don't want to make the client feel like their space is being judged. And finally, acknowledging what is happening can help ground a client. These are really tough questions. For some people, it helps to take a moment to focus on breathing. As we do in most things in clinic, we are going to reflect on the interview after the interview. This is really important as we plan for other client interviews and other meetings with the same client. Think about what went well. What was hard for the client to talk about? Was that expected? Unexpected? What might you try differently during your next meeting with this client? What might you try with other clients?
And most importantly, remember, you've got this. You have got all the skills you need to do an excellent trauma-informed client interview.